gods still walked among men, there lived one Viking whose name the North still whispers. Egil Skallagrimsson, warrior, poet, and something far darker, born under a curse, a child who spilled blood before he learned mercy. His words could bend fate, his rage could end kings. Some called him mad, others claimed Odin himself spoke through him. He carved runes in blood, buried silver no man dared touch, and left behind a tomb that still defies the laws of death. These are the 10 dark secrets of Egil Saga, truths lost in time, waiting to be uncovered. Top 10 dark secrets about Egil Saga, history or pure myth. The North, a place where gods whispered in storms, and men carved their names in frost and blood. On a night when the sea boiled and the sky cracked open with lightning, a child came screaming into the world. His name was Egil Skallagrimsson. Some say he was born of man. Others swear Odin himself placed his spirit inside a mortal shell to write, to fight, to destroy. But the first of his secrets was written long before he ever spoke. Secret number 10, the cursed birth. The saga tells us, when Egil was born, his mother saw a shadow fall across the fire. An old woman, a seer, was called to bless the newborn. But instead, she stared into his dark, lifeless eyes and whispered, "This child will bring as much death as words." They say his father, Skallagrim, a fierce warrior and blacksmith, laughed at the curse. But laughter turned to fear when, the very next day, every spark in his forge died. His iron cracked, his hammer split, and his horse dropped dead without reason. In Viking belief, this was not coincidence. It was a sign that the boy carried something beyond mortal strength. As he grew, Egil spoke little. He watched, he listened, and when he looked at others, they looked away. They called him Trollborn. They said his skull was too thick, his stare too heavy, his silence too dark. But fate, it seems, was sharpening a blade. Secret number 9, the child who killed. At the age of 7, Egil joined a local game, gnat-like, Viking ball fighting, part sport, part battle. The children of the village gathered on frozen ground, cheering, shouting, throwing wooden clubs and fists. But when an older boy mocked him, struck him to the ground and spat, calling him troll spawn, Egil stood in silence. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He walked away. Moments later, he returned, holding his father's axe. The game stopped. The laughter died. And with one clean strike, Egil split the boy's skull in two. Blood on snow. A child among children, standing over his first kill. His father, Skallagrim, said nothing. His mother wept. And that night, the seer's words returned to the wind. This child will bring as much death as words. But instead of punishment, Egil was praised by some. A true warrior's son, fearless and proud. The rest feared him. Yet that act, that first killing, set Egil on a path no god or man could halt. The sagas are full of killers, but few killed like Egil, and even fewer spoke like him. Because Egil was more than a warrior. He was a skald, a poet of the old world, and with his words came power darker than steel. Secret number 8, the skald's dark gift. In Norse tradition, poetry was more than art. It was magic. Each word was believed to hold a rune's soul, a key to fate itself. Egil could weave verses like spells. He learned from his ancestors that Odin, the All-Father, was both god of war and poetry, and that true poets could bend the will of kings. When Egil spoke, even warriors held their breath. He wrote poems that cursed his enemies, hexed their crops, and blessed his ships. His words could damn or save, depending on his mood. Once, after a betrayal by a powerful earl, Egil carved runes on a whale bone, then sang in stang, a pole of shame, against his foe. The next morning, the earl's cattle were dead, his wife struck with madness, his son lost at sea. Coincidence, or Odin's gift made flesh? Those who heard him recite said his eyes turned black as the night sea, his voice deep as thunder. They feared his poetry more than his axe, for they believed his verses came from a place between worlds, from the dead themselves. But here's where the mystery deepens. Modern historians say Egil's poetry still exists, over 60 stanzas of ancient Norse verse. But some of them make no sense in normal language. They twist meaning, hide curses, bury names. One verse, carved into an Icelandic stone, was found centuries later. Its translation: I give my words to wind and blood, to death I speak, to life I nod. Was it art, or a spell that still breathes beneath the ice? By now, Egil had become more than a man. He was a storm walking, a poet with rage for ink and destiny for a pen. But behind his growing legend was a hunger for vengeance, for blood, for something only death could satisfy. For the North was changing. Kings were rising, and with them pride. Egil's clan, once loyal to Norway's crown, would soon find themselves hunted by the very men they once called brothers. And in that blood feud, in that storm of steel and sorrow, Egil would reveal the next of his dark secrets. But that is where the story turns red. By the time Egil reached manhood, the North was bleeding. Old loyalties shattered like shields, and new kings rose from the ashes of dead chieftains. Among them was King Eric Bloodaxe, a name carved into fear itself. Egil's family once served the royal line, but ambition is a fire that devours even kin. And soon, the friendship between houses turned to hatred. It began with a betrayal, and a killing that would set the world ablaze. Secret number 7, the blood feud begins. Egil's brother, Thorolf, was loyal to King Eric. He fought in his armies, sailed his wars, and earned honor. Too much honor. Jealous whispers reached the queen's ear. And one cold morning, without warning or trial, Thorolf was slain by royal order. When the news reached Egil, something inside him broke, not with grief, but with wrath. He gathered his men, his axe, and his rage, and swore a blood oath before Odin's shrine. The gods may have his soul, but I'll have his killers. That night, under a moon the color of bone, Egil struck. He raided Eric's ships, butchered his guards, and burned his banners. He even killed the king's own son in combat, then carved runes on his corpse so that his spirit would never rest. From that moment, Egil was an outlaw, a walking curse on royal blood. And so began the saga's longest shadow, a war between a king crowned in blood and a poet who sang with it. Secret number 6, the mad Viking of York. Exiled and hunted, Egil fled across the seas. To England, to York, a city that once bowed to Viking steel. There, his legend grew darker. Locals called him the Mad Skald. They said he drank more mead than 10 men, fought without armor, and laughed in the middle of battle. Others swore they saw him carve runes into his skin before combat, whispering to unseen spirits. He raided English villages, slaughtered lords, and vanished into fog. But the strangest tale comes from a monk's chronicle, written decades later, describing a Norseman who spoke with ravens and who could not die. When Egil's ship was wrecked in a storm near the Humber River, all his crew drowned. All but him. He washed ashore alive, clutching a black feather in his hand. Coincidence? Or was the raven, Odin's messenger, watching over him? Madness and myth began to blur. Was he guided by gods, or haunted by them? For in every town he left behind, blood followed. And yet, when the sun rose, Egil sat alone, carving poems into driftwood, whispering them into the sea. But even a madman has moments of love and loss. In Iceland, he had a wife, Astrid, his anchor in the storm. Their union was not peace, but it was human. She watched the man the world feared most grow quiet when he looked at his children, until tragedy struck again. One by one, his sons died, some in war, some to illness, one lost at sea. And when Egil buried his last, something in his heart turned to ice. Secret number 5, the Raven's Oath. The sagas say that on the night of his son's death, Egil walked alone to the cliffs. He stood there until dawn, not moving, not speaking. Then he raised his arms to the black sky and cried out, "Odin, take what you gave. I have nothing left but rage." Some say he was begging the Allfather for death. Others that he made an oath instead. From that night on, Egil carried a raven banner, a sigil of Odin, into every battle. He fought like one possessed, untouched by blade or arrow. Witnesses claimed the banner moved even when the wind did not. And whenever Egil killed, ravens circled above. Coincidence? Or a god claiming his chosen? But there's another secret hidden beneath that oath, a ritual forbidden even among pagans. The saga hints that Egil performed blot, human sacrifice, to summon Odin's favor. Bodies hung from ash trees. Blood poured on the soil. All for victory. Historians debate if this was true, but the poems he left behind suggest something darker. Lines praising Odin for filling my cup with blood and wisdom. Did the god truly answer him? Or did Egil simply lose what little of himself remained? Secret number 4, the murdered king. Years passed, and fate brought Egil face to face with his old enemy, King Eric Bloodaxe, the same king who killed his brother, the same king who hunted him for decades. They met again, in England. Eric now ruled the city of York, under the crown of Northumbria, and Egil, ever the storm, came seeking reckoning. But history is murky here, torn between truth and legend. The saga says Egil was captured by the king's guards, bound in chains, thrown into a cold stone cell to await execution at dawn. There he sat in darkness, and did what he always did. He wrote. Through that endless night, he carved verses into the wood of his cell, a poem called Head Ransom. A plea to the king, but also a weapon. In his words, he praised Eric's courage, his rule, his destiny, flattery laced with strange rhythm, ancient runes hidden between lines. When dawn came, Egil recited it aloud. Eric listened and then, impossibly, released him. Why? Perhaps the poem moved him. Perhaps it cursed him. Because not long after that day, Eric Bloodaxe was dead, ambushed in battle, struck down with no wounds healing, as if the gods themselves had marked him. The Icelandic saga claims Egil's poem spared his life, but took another's. Did the skald truly kill a king with words alone? Or is it myth, a warning of what poetry once meant in the age of gods? Egil returned home after that, older, bitter, empty. His enemies were gone, his sons were dead, and his poems had turned to ashes in his mouth. He was said to have buried his treasures beneath his hall, muttering that no man will ever find it unless Odin wills it. But the North remembers, and his story was not finished, because one final secret lay hidden in the earth, in his bones, and in the question that would haunt scholars for centuries. Egil Skallagrimsson, poet, warrior, outlaw, and now an old man surrounded by ghosts. He had fought kings, buried sons, defied death, and lived long enough to become a shadow in his own homeland. But even legends leave echoes behind, and some of those echoes refuse to fade. Secret number 3, the curse of the silver. The sagas tell us that in his final years, Egil hid his treasure, 2 chests filled with silver, taken from England during his raids. But this was no ordinary hoard. It was said to be cursed. Egil believed the silver came from blood money, a gift once sent by King Athelstan of England as payment for peace. But peace never came, and Egil's heart was already poisoned by grief. So one night, he took his treasure out beyond his farm. The wind howled. The moon burned pale. There, he dug a deep pit in the black soil and muttered to himself, "Gold brings greed. Silver brings sorrow. Let the ground keep them both." Then, according to the saga, he whispered runes over the chests, binding them so that anyone who sought them out of greed would suffer ruin. Days later, neighbors found the soil torn open, as if by claws. No silver, no tracks, only the marks of something dragged back underground. Centuries have passed, and treasure hunters still search for Egil's lost silver. Some claim to have found hints, strange runic stones, fragments of chests, cursed fields where nothing grows. But none have found the hoard, and every attempt ends the same way, in disaster, death, or disappearance. Coincidence or curse. But there's something darker still, an unspoken belief among Icelanders that Egil didn't just curse the silver. He buried his spirit with it, a final act of defiance, a poet so consumed by pain that even death couldn't silence him. Secret number 2, the poem that saved his life. Long before the buried silver, long before the grave, came Egil's greatest secret, the night he defeated death itself with a poem. The saga calls it Sonadrek, the loss of sons. He wrote it after the death of his last child, when grief had hollowed him into a shell of rage. He wanted to starve himself, to die in silence. But his daughter, Thorgerd, refused. She told him that the gods had stolen his sons, but they could not have his words. So Egil lifted his head and began to write. The poem that followed is unlike anything in Viking lore. It's raw, broken, and furious, not praise for the gods, but accusation. Odin, breaker of oaths, you took my sons and left me hollow. I gave you blood and song, and you gave me silence. Historians call it the first true expression of personal grief in European poetry, but to the old Norse it was blasphemy. A mortal cursing Odin, a man defying fate itself. They say when Egil finished the poem, the storm outside his hall stopped. For the first time in days, the wind died, the candles steadied, and the old warrior wept, not for his losses, but because he had finally beaten the god who owned him. From that night on, Egil lived, quieter, older, slower, but alive, as if the poem had bought him a few more winters. He had cursed kings and slain foes, but with that poem, he conquered something greater, the silence of despair. And in that moment, Egil Skallagrimsson became more than legend. He became eternal. But legends, no matter how strong, eventually fall to dust. Or so we thought. Secret number 1, the Forbidden Tomb. In 1719, near Borg, Iceland, the ruins of Egil's ancestral hall, a strange discovery was made. Workers digging foundations for a new building unearthed something old and unnatural. A grave. Inside, a skeleton. But one detail froze them where they stood. The skull. It was massive, thick, round, unbreakable. So hard, in fact, that when one of the men struck it with an axe out of curiosity, the axe bounced off. The man swore the skull rang like iron. Later scholars examined it, and their notes still survive. The skull, believed to belong to Egil Skallagrimsson, was of extraordinary density. It resisted every attempt at damage. Coincidence? Genetic anomaly? Or proof that the saga's descriptions were no myth? Even stranger, the skeleton was found headless. The skull had been moved separately, as if hidden on purpose. Buried alone, apart from the body. Locals whispered that the skull had been taken from its rest centuries earlier by men seeking protection, that whoever kept it near would never fall in battle. One Icelandic priest wrote, "They say the skull of Egil brings luck in war, but madness in peace." No one knows where it is now, lost again to the soil, or guarded by the same curse that kept his silver buried. But in that moment, when the axe struck and the sound rang like iron, the line between history and myth shattered. Was Egil truly a man of bone and blood, or was he something forged by the gods? Centuries later, historians still argue, archaeologists still dig, and poets still whisper his verses. Verses that sound less like words and more like spells. Egil Skallagrimsson, the man who wrote his rage into history, who defied kings, gods, and death, who proved that even in the age of iron, words could cut deeper than any blade. Epilogue, the last verse. So what was he truly? A murderer? A poet? A prophet touched by madness? Maybe all three. Maybe none. But one thing is certain. In the sagas of men, no story burns this long unless it hides some truth beneath the ash. Perhaps Egil's secret was not in his strength, nor in his curses, but in his refusal to be forgotten. Because even now, more than 1,000 years later, we still speak his name. And in the north, where wind and sea still meet, some say you can hear him, a voice in the storm, reciting the verses he swore would never die. If this tale of the dark skald stirred something within you, then you carry a spark of the Viking spirit, the hunger to question, to defy, to remember. So join us, fellow seeker of sagas. Like this video if you believe the legend still breathes. Comment below. Do you think Egil was man or myth? And subscribe for more forgotten truths carved in frost, blood, and fire. Because this is not the end of the story, only the next verse.